So far today, we've talked about what finance is, how finance works together, and now we've put together a panel of experts who've been trying to do this over a period of time and have got some real practical experience. So we're welcoming Zaheer back to the panel, Malango, Thaven, and rest. So if I can ask each of you to introduce yourselves. Zaheer, we'll skip you and give the other panelists a chance to introduce themselves. And if we can start with you, Malango.
My name is Kanju. I am Director and Head of Operations for an entity called Indalo Inclusive South Africa. We host a program called SEED. I think many of you will know SEED. We were formed in 2002 during the World Summit on Sustainable Development. And our main focus and mandate is to look at what we call equal and inclusive entrepreneurship development. So we identify, support, and promote what we call, equal inclusive entrepreneurship, or commonly known as social and green enterprises in South Africa. Yeah.
Thank you. Thaven?
My name is Devon Naidu. I'm the Southern Africa Coordinator for the Private Finance Advisory Network, which is a global finance accelerator. And we've been working primarily in the renewable energy space, looking now to work more in the adaptation space. And essentially, we help projects access private sector finance in the $1 million to $50 million range by providing professional services free of charge to the projects that we work with.
Very good.
Hi, I'm Milan Gomuwo. I'm the MD of a small consulting firm called ZeniZeni Sustainable Finance. So I'll touch on what I think of as sustainable finance later. But essentially, we advise governments on policy issues around sustainable finance, but also project preparation. So taking projects to funds like the GCF and to other funders in general.
Let's start with you, Rest. What is the opportunity for emerging enterprises and small businesses in this adaptation space?
We work in what I would call the coalface. We work on the ground, and we run a project currently funded by the government of Flanders on climate adaptation, and quite a reasonable component of that program, consistent with our mandate, looks at identifying the climate adaptation type of entrepreneurs. We just happen to have an unfortunate thing of focusing on rural areas. So now, here's where the frustration is. If you hear what Zaheer was saying, that they're looking for projects that are transformative, innovative. You don't find that in rural areas in South Africa. We're struggling quite a lot ourselves. So I do think that there's two levels of intervention and opportunity. One is what I would call, building capacity of ecosystem enablers. So for selfish reasons, for people like ourselves, as SEED or Indalo, to actually operate and navigate in that space as either as intermediaries or supporters of this kind of enterprises. Because what you have, many reports, including the GEM report, will tell you that our entrepreneurial activity in this country is very low, and that type of stuff. So there's a lot of developmental impetus and developmental efforts that we need to inject into the space in order to build, and de-risk, the challenge and that we have in that graph that you've provided there, Steve. So I think that there's one. But the second thing, it's again looking at directly funding some of these small things that don't have huge margins, because if you don't do that, you will never get to that 500 million level. So it feels like there's a lot of need, whether it be government or private sector, to really inject a lot of resources around that space in order to stimulate growth of that entrepreneurial activity at that particular space. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I think that's where what we see on a day-to-day basis, and I think that's where the need is.
Okay, maybe just to follow up. Are there specific donor funds or international funds or even domestic funds, government incentives that feed into this kind of entrepreneurial business creation space?
Very little. You mentioned, and again, Zaheer said, one of the things that you see in South Africa is that your bilateral missions and traditional donors are saying bye-bye to us. There's hardly, I mean, we've been talking to a number of embassies and missions in South Africa, and they will tell you this middle income story time and again. And they will actually then immediately move into the need of, stimulating trade relations between themselves and the South African government or South African entrepreneurs. Now, if you're talking to the Royal Netherlands Embassy and you're looking for trade issues, they're not talking small. They're talking big stuff. So answer to that question, are there many of those available? Not really. There's few that are remaining. We're very fortunate with the government of Flanders that we're doing that type of work with them. But in 2 years' time, they are saying bye-bye. We're being saved now by DEFF, your department, and Treasury, that insisted on a framework partnership agreement to say we want to monitor what you're doing from a climate adaptation point of view. From a government side, I do know that the IDC, as a government bank, has decided to, because they also, I heard, don't quote me on this, that a lot of their directors didn't get bonuses last year, primarily because they did not invest a lot of money, they could not find pipeline, and that type of stuff. So they've decided to invest a lot of what they call grant money, into this space of social entrepreneurship, where there's so much need in as far as vulnerability and need for creating resilient communities. They put a lot of money into that to try and see if they can build a pipeline. And they use an eye of a commercial banking due diligence system to assess whether this is bankable or not. And if they fund it, then you get into that consensual, maybe not debt as such, but blended finance type of arrangement. But again, it's only 50 million rand budget that they've got. So you've got that challenge. So, yeah.
Yeah. It seems that we have this general challenge of scaling investment in simultaneously two critical areas of our economy. One is adaptation resilience, and the other is economic inclusiveness, right? And so as much as it's a daunting challenge, the opportunity is enormous. Malango, you wanted to talk a bit about sustainable finance, and I'm very happy to have an alternate view of my rather cynical take.
No, it's similar to mine. Finance is finance. It's been around for centuries, probably ever since whatever man came about. In my view, the sustainability aspect of it, and where I choose to work, is where there's an actual sustainable impact that can be defined, and there's an intention of that finance to achieve that impact. That's all that sustainable finance is. And bearing in mind also some of those risk issues, they don't come, it's not a thumb suck. I'm a banker by training and profession, past life. It's experience that the risk is because we've lost money. And that's why. So depending on whose money you're using, you have to be extremely careful. So to your point, that the GCF and some of these big international funds, even the IDC gets, and say the DBSA, they get money in the market. But if they're under problems, there's an implicit guarantee back to the government. Which is still government, even though they may be borrowing in the market. As you can see now with the Escoms and Transnet, there may not be an explicit guarantee from the government, but it's implicit because the government owns these institutions and they don't want them to go under. So therefore, that's where the risk factor comes in. So my message about finance is that, as I say, it's been around forever. It is what it is. And the sources of finance are pretty much the same. So even if it's the government, like where's that coming from? It's coming from individuals' taxes and things like that, some savings from individuals. That's never going to change. But some of the things, the innovations, I think, especially in that bottom space, high risk, early stage development, and it's small, but all the sources of financing finance goes where it's welcome. So in South Africa, for example, and this has happened in other countries as well, is I'm sure you've heard a lot about gender finance. So finance which is trying to achieve positive gender outcomes, for example. So in South Africa, a group of women got together and said, we want to do this. And people are investing in amounts of 150,000 Rand, which for a certain income bracket is, people can lose that money. It's high risk. And they're willing to invest in early stage projects. And this is completely private, but it's actually individuals coming together to form this. So the innovations are actually happening. They're at a too smaller scale for the sort of things we're talking about now. But I'm mentioning this to say that if you think outside the box and you can actually achieve that scale, the finance is there. You just have to meet, these women want to help other women doing business. So figure out a way of matching that with whatever you're trying to do. Yes, that's one of my key messages around this, is that all finance is trying to find a home and to be welcome. You've got to figure out how to welcome that finance in a way. Yeah.
So Thaven, in your experience shifting your model towards adaptation, what are the lessons that you've learned? What are some of the things that we need to change?
I think there's quite a few issues at stake. I mean, the first one is whether we are market creator or market responder. So we're not out there to help create adaptation projects. We're there to try and help projects with an adaptation angle access finance. And I think that there's a big issue around the naming of projects as adaptation projects. So for a financier, they're not actually interested in what you call it. You can adaptation, mitigation, a pink elephant. You can call it whatever you want. They're looking at it. Does this project perform in terms of its financial capability? And around adaptation itself, there's issues. So if you're saying that you want to work with adaptation projects, if you look at a seed company, and this seed company now wants to start selling seeds that will allow farmers who are keeping cattle to stop their cattle from free grazing, but be able to produce fodder that will then allow you a greater carrying capacity on the land. So it's a seed company that's doing this. Is that an adaptation project? So how you define adaptation projects becomes very important, and the degree of separability of the adaptation component to the entire business. So can you call this company, the seed company that comes for finance to you, as them seeking finance for an adaptation project? They just want to expand the range of seeds that they're selling. So from a PFAN perspective, we've tried to be as inclusive as possible as opposed to being exclusive, trying to find ways to say, though it's not an adaptation project, we're trying to find ways to say it is an adaptation project. And when you look at it from that perspective, there are certain sectors that are high priority sectors. So you then start looking at, so what is your approach to finding the projects? We're not creating the projects, we're responding to the market. So certainly in Africa and in other developing regions of the world, agriculture is a high priority sector. And you have the issue again of scalability. How do you get to the kind of scale that the financiers are looking to finance? Again, if you look at the seed company as an example, you can finance the company itself, or you can finance the purchasers of the seed. And the way you finance each of those would be completely different. So how do you look at the agricultural sector as a whole, and who you should be financing, and what mechanisms you have to do that financing? And then when you start defining it as adaptation finance, the kind of processes to access the finance start becoming different if you're going to make it specifically, if you're going to fit it into this definition of adaptation. There's all kinds of issue with regard to what it is you are trying to address and how you measure it. Now, all of that is outside of the ambit of the financial performance of the project. So suddenly you're bringing all these other kinds of criteria to play. And for PFAN as a finance accelerator, all we are trying to do is trying to help the project proponent access the finance to implement the project more quickly. So it would have got finance. All we're doing is we're speeding it up. So we're not actually involved in all of these peripheral things, but to some extent we're finding that you can't exclude those things. So it's becoming a hindrance as opposed to something that is supporting the sector.
Can you explain that a bit more?
I'm saying that if you look at financing a project and you say you're going to finance it on the financial performance of the project, that's straightforward. If you start saying that actually you're calling it an adaptation project, therefore you have to define what it is you're trying to adapt to. And then at the end of receiving the finance, we want to be able to measure how well have you adapted to what you define. You know, all of that is extraneous to the financial performance so it becomes a hindrance as opposed to a facilitation process.
So there's a cost to positioning your project as an adaptation project, right? For a class of project that's already making money. So when would you bother? When does it become worth making it an adaptation project?
For us, what we're seeing is that ideally what you want to do is you want to increase the bucket size of where this money is. And certainly we understand that there's a lot of money going to be available for adaptation. Our challenge now becomes defining the projects that we can access as adaptation and finding mechanisms to reduce the cost, the transaction cost of all of these peripheral activities. So there's a lot of alignment now between adaptation and a lot of the SDGs. There's a lot of alignment between adaptation and just pure development. And from a PFAN perspective, we think that there's going to be a lot of opportunity for helping projects access these kinds of finance if we all can understand these processes better.
So Zaheer, I mean, essential thesis to the work that we're doing is thinking about positioning projects the private sector are already doing, but as adaptation projects. Now, to some degree, that's repositioning a project that was happening, perhaps adding some complexity. Will that fly? Is that something that a GCF board might accept?
No, it's a good point that you raised there. I mean, that's the very question that's coming up in the GCF, where people are actually asking, well, is this an adaptation project or is it a developmental project? But the reasons why they're asking the question is not what you're thinking of. Reasons these questions are coming up is to try and find elegant ways of not funding those proposals in a manner that makes sense. I just think of, there's a quote, I'm not sure if it was Rumi or somebody said that. You know, when I started of this work some years back, there's something about, you know, when I'm young and I'm clever, I try to change the world. Now that I'm older and wiser, I change myself. We can try and change all these funds and try and redefine the way the funds, and it's never going to happen. You know, a banker is a banker and will always think like a banker. You know, some people always talk about green bonds now. I was at one event, I had to talk about bonds. And I realized that one of the first bonds was done in the 1200 or 1300, somewhere there, where it was the UK that issued a bond to go fight a war against Netherlands. But today everybody's saying green bonds is the way to go. It's just repackaging the same stuff. So sustainable finance, money, the dollar is always green. It's never going to change its color. I think the point that there is that what we need to become smart in the sense that depending on what they want to hear, you got to present them with something that they want to hear. Whether you call it adaptation or whether you call it mitigation, you're going to do everything possible to get that yes answer. You know? And that's what we've, I think sometimes also we have become very, especially when you're like a greenie, you think the whole world is out there to help you because you're green, and forget that. You know, what you hear and what happens in reality is two very different things. I'll give you an example on the GCF. There's one country that would preach in the fund about wanting to help the poorest, would preach in the fund about how to empower women because, and then when a project came from a poor woman community, I said, no, we can't fund this project because the country from which this project comes from is a middle income country. So all those priorities that you had in there, it's gone out of the... So the point is that we just need to start working collectively. Us in government who sit on all these boards and funds, together with yourself, and do like what the Godfather did, and make them an offer they cannot refuse. Because not leaving a house there. But you got to understand what are those buttons that make people positively. Now, if I go with a project to the GCF, and if the project ticks the box of gender, and it ticks the box of private sector, and it ticks the box of poor, and it ticks the box of leveraging, these are all things that are going to make people amenable to approving the project, right? So I should actually sometimes come down that high and mighty horse of saying, I have the most wonderful. Sometimes you'll have to adapt things to meet the circumstances. But also, adaptation is not just about building a wall and that, right? There's also about the resilience aspects of it. We did a figure. The minister is now president of AMSN, so she's now leading the African continent on issues of climate change and that. And one of the things we found that just through extreme weather events, African countries spend almost 9% of their GDP just to deal with weather events, right? So if you are going to build resilience, however small that may be, can you imagine the impact you're going to have on your GDP, right? And not that there's this thing now, GDP doesn't necessarily speak to jobs or anything like that, but it puts you in a much better position to and I think there are a lot of opportunities. You talked of seeds, and without name dropping, a very rich guy who came and played tennis here in South Africa together with other two tennis players. I had a meeting with him in Paris during the Paris COP. And the only reason he met with me is because I was the chair of the GCF board. Otherwise, wouldn't even bother speaking to me. And he wanted $1 billion. He wanted me to approve $1 billion, and he would put $1 billion of his own money, and they would together give the money to Monsanto, who would do research work on drought-resistant seeds, which they would make available to Africa. Nice. And that was, in their view, the way to deal with adaptation and food security in Africa. Right? So people are thinking out already these kind of things. Right? But obviously, Monsanto and all of I think it's the first time in life where I've told that person no, but I think there's a lot of opportunities. It's just about thinking smartly. If you're looking at the potential impacts of climate change on the agricultural sector in South Africa, let's say, already people are doing work in terms of how do we build resilience to that. What is the application of new technologies or whatever else? I'm not an agricultural person, but I'm sure there must be economic opportunities that are out there, because if you can find new technologies to be able to deal with, let's say, the impacts of drought on agricultural sector, those technologies become very marketable not only in South Africa but to the rest of the world. And if you are leaders in that field, so the question is, where do you see South Africa? Do you see somebody that is continuously acquiring foreign technology or continuously? In our vision in the department, it's not just about dealing with mitigation or adaptation, but how can we sit down together with a company like ESCOM or CESOL or the others, and not only about helping them mitigate or whatever, but putting them in a position that they are globally competitive 10, 15 years down the road. Right? And that is that's the kind of ethos that we're trying to work with. But I think that the missing thing is, how do you actually do that? Because there is still this divide that private sector is there, government is there. The role of government is just we slap more taxes on you or more standards. We don't, and somebody, I see like organizations like NBI or the others, who builds that bridge, right? And who's the one that initiates that? Obviously, we won't see eye to eye on everything. But for us as a government department that has the priority of reducing emissions, and us as the priority of having to submit these nationally determined contributions to the global, it is in our interest to help, because you are the ones who are generating the emissions, right? But it is in our interest to do that. It's in our interest to do that. So maybe don't call the dog a dog. Maybe we call it a a hound or a wolf or something, but you got to do what needs to be done to get the thing happen in a responsible manner. But there is no large amounts of cash out there in the initial stage, like on your, and that's why we need to better utilize things like the GCF and the others as the unlockers for that bigger cash, because that bigger cash is not going to just come running to our doors.
Does the panel want to respond to anything that's been said so far?
The resilience, I think both of you mentioned the word resilience, and I think that's, so from personal experience, actually currently preparing a project for GCF, not in South Africa, in Zambia, but an experience with other projects, trying to find funding everywhere, is my advice is to say, look at resilience more broadly, and adaptation can sometimes come through from that, but it's about thinking in a slightly different way. Because if you have a resilience mindset, you want to make your project resilient, however it's designed or however it's going to be funded. And then you're more likely to find that adaptation angle. It might only be 30% of the project could qualify, say, as adaptation, but you found that 30%. And an example, and this wasn't the project I worked on, but it got multilateral funding from people like MCC, and it was a water treatment plant in Lusaka. And they were very concerned. They thought their biggest risks were the water supply coming into the treatment plant. And anyway, they've now, instead of looking, so the climate models for Zambia show certain things, but they decided to do a bottom-up approach. It's something called the climate risk-informed decision analysis. And they say, they didn't ask the question, is climate affecting you in some way? They said to the operations manager at the plant, like, what keeps you awake at night? And it had nothing to do with water. It had everything to do with the security of power supply. And in Zambia, the vast majority of power supply is hydro, which is affected by climate. So in thinking, asking a different question, and largely about resilience, which is the question, what keeps you awake at night, an operations manager, you're asking about how do you make this plant resilient? They arrived at a different answer, and they didn't get funding from GCF. That wasn't, but they did get. It was part of MCC, the usual big sort of funders. So I think the resilience conversation, which I think business does naturally anyway. So your flood example, business often in South Africa is having to react to this, and has been for some time, and is trying to find solutions. It's about resilience of your business ultimately. The challenge with GCF, and this is one of the current projects I'm working on, is they want data. Baseline to say, this is what's happening now. If we did this project with GCF funding to this is what's happening now. Some of it has been caused by climate change. Does that data exist? Often not. Particularly, depending on the area, because the climate models don't necessarily go down to that level, that you can have that degree of certainty. And on top of that, there's the additionality factor to say, well, if we were not involved at all, would the project go ahead? If it does, then that part, you just keep funding. We'll only do the extra bit that would not have happened had there not been GCF funding. So it gets quite complicated. But if you have that resilience approach, and I think this, even in some of the projects you mentioned now, and try to collect data and use some of the tools that are out there, which are designed to address resilience, you might be able to find the adaptation issue may come through, surprisingly, or not. But then there are other pots of funds you can go to.
And again, you're blending, right? You've got a portion of this that's adaptation-driven. You're bringing in other sources of development finance for other issues. I think one of the clear messages I've got today is, in order for us to scale up our efforts, we have to find ways to aggregate different things that we're doing and to start working across a range of potential financial sources. I want to open the floor to the audience. Are there any questions that you might have?
Hi, to the colleague who is in the advisory business in developing projects. I was keen to know where you may have seen success in the Southern Africa region, perhaps not just South Africa, and what you think the trends are. When Rest spoke, he said he felt a bit, again, I won't say downhearted, but he wasn't as encouraged. And as a banker and someone who sees finance as having been around a long time, do you think we're going to be able to make the shifts that are needed? And what's your experience been?
Just success in terms of getting funding or achieving the goals that the project originally intended?
Principally in getting funding. Are projects that you've worked on, do they seem close to closing? We talked about a 2-year time frame to get some funding. Is that your experience? Just keen to get a sense. And then how, with PFAN sitting next to you, a bit more agnostic, is there ways to work together in your thinking?
Yeah, so the projects I've been working on have not necessarily been purely private sector. So public sector driven, but some involving the private sector as well. And in terms of accessing the international big funds, not success, but they're all work in progress because it takes a long time. And a lot of my work has been in the agricultural and water sector, and some of the data needed takes time to gather. So there are some successes, but it's very. So I work as part of a team. There are engineers, hydrologists, climate specialists, environmental, social, gender. It's a large team, and that's where the success comes from because there are all the different requirements of all these funds. Not only just the funds, even if you go to the DBSA these requirements are there. So that where there's a cohesive team looking at the different aspects, there's some success. But often we will say, oh, GCF is a last resort because it takes so long. And the guarantees are not necessarily there, and Zaheer can speak to this. The perception is that it's government, so there are political motivations about whether certain projects are approved or not, or what goes through. There are too many unknowns outside of control. And so in terms of trends, so one of the things I mentioned, I did policy work, and in terms of some of the trends, I'd worked with some people in this room actually on the climate change adaptation strategy, the financing component for South Africa. And one of the things I recommended as an outside consultant to the process was to say, not ignore the international funds, but they're there and they be very, very strategic as a country, because again, programmatic level as a country, very useful, but otherwise the costs and some of the issues that have to be addressed now, you won't get there in time because of the time frame. So I'd say the trends are very much look local. I mentioned that small gender fund. I mean, there's a lot more crowdfunding platforms. They seem very out of the way, but they're building up and they will change significantly. Some of the ideas that you've mentioned, using CSI money much more effectively. So I think finding sources of finance locally is the trend, and allowing what you mentioned about the financial sector. The financial sector needs to change its flows, how it allocates money, but on the mitigation side, it's happening anyway. Irrespective of what the policy is doing, irrespective of what it's happening anyway. I say the finance sector is amoral. They'll go where they need to go. And so things are changing very, very quickly there. But if as business, if you can engage more with the regulators to say, actually, make it easier for us to be able to address some of these issues, I do think because of the outside pressures that are coming globally, the shifts are more likely to happen. That's...
I mean, I think that a lot of these kinds of projects, certainly if you look at the way mitigation projects developed, there was a long period when the risk was perceived as very high. And then over time that risk was reduced. And I think we have the same situation now with adaptation projects. And people are talking a lot about the role of blended finance. And the entire field of blending, I think, is developing. And certainly what we find in PFAN is that projects that have received some level of grants and some level of concessional finance have been able to reduce their risk enough for a private sector investor to be now willing to look at them. So yes, blended finance is an interesting sector to look at in terms of how it can facilitate accessing finance for adaptation. But that process of blending, who does the blending? Is it the project developer? Is it the person who's wanting to provide the finance? They're not really skilled to do it. So it's somebody somewhere in this process, but that person hasn't yet been identified. And even once you get to later stages of the project, the kind of risk mitigation finance components that need to come into play, I think the who's going to do that, where that responsibility lies, is not yet very clear. So while we understand that there's a huge opportunity and we're starting to see it play out, all of these roles are not yet defined, if that makes sense.
It makes sense, and I want to kind of build on that, and maybe I'm sensing a kind of negativity emerging out of the event, that this is too hard. But it's what's 1,000 million? Is that a lot? 1,000 million rand? Is that a trillion? A billion? Billion, right? The NBI has been part of 3 separate consortiums that have raised R1 billion over the last 2 years. Right? In energy efficiency, in adaptation finance, financing of catchments. So it is possible, right? And if I think about that process, it took an extraordinarily long time. Not necessarily because the GCF is bad, but because we were thinking naively, hey, we're going to borrow 100 million rand here, the GCF will give it to us. GCF is like 100 million rand is a lot of money. What's your business model? Where's your data? How are you going to pay this back? And it actually took us a lot longer to think through, how does that work? How are we going to pay this back? How's the market going to work? And I guess that is good due diligence from the GCF. But having done that now, like one of the curveballs that was thrown to us is you have to have a gender plan. We hadn't anticipated a gender plan. Now, fortunately, the NBI's got a gender team, so we dispatched our gender team and they went and developed a gender plan. But that took us 4 or 5 months to start thinking through what has to be in this kind of plan. But now we've done that. And so the next cycle will be a lot faster, right? And the reason why we assembled the panel in the way that we have is that there are people in the country who have been doing this for some time and have learned these lessons. So it's not that we're starting from scratch, right? If we need to integrate small businesses and entrepreneurship, we can rely on some of the expertise of Seed. Our other panelists have started to investigate, how does this work? When do you bring the private sector in? What do they care about? And so a lot of this is about collaboration. And if I think about the projects that we've put together that have got money, they are public-private sector partnerships in the truest sense. And the energy efficiency one involves the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy. It involves part of public works. It involves local government. It involves DEFF. It involves us. It involves the Carbon Trust. So it's quite a big partnership. And by us, that's by default all of you, right? And then the catchment management one involves SANBI, the WRC, ourselves. Like there's a huge breadth of people and expertise that are involved in these projects. So I think part of the innovation that we have to do, and part of this project that we're running now, is to say, what are these partnerships? Where do these skills sit? How do we build things that are actually going to work and that are actually going to get funded? There will need to be a tolerance for timelines. It's going to take us a year or two to build these projects, but I'm optimistic that we can do this and have some major impact. Any other questions from the floor?
So I think maybe in terms of how we take something forward or something tangible forward, is there any proposals on the table to look at? I mean, if you're looking at core benefits and addressing a number of priorities, if we just look at the just transition as an example, which seeks to achieve or address a number of national circumstances over and above the energy and climate transition that needs to take place in South Africa, is there that opportunity within a sort of a national flagship type of project to utilize or access such funding, looking at public-private partnerships and the stakeholders and collaboration to realize this at some point in time?
Yeah, I mean,
I probably was the first one to throw the word despondency in my first comment, but I do agree with you, Steve, that there is hope. Take BEE, for example. How old is BEE policies now in this country? 20-something years. In the beginning, we were quite, pessimistic, some of us, about it. We didn't know how it was going to work. It has undergone a number of evolutionary processes to the point where we are today, and it's almost inherent within us, within our systems. The government and private sector, we're responding to that. So I do agree with you, Steve, that if you have a collaborative effort, then we keep on pushing. There could be a time where this whole issue of climate change adaptation being a risk, not being a risk anymore, it is de-risked properly, and we actually are able to respond appropriately. And in fact, even investors are able to fund it. But I also do see a hope in the narrative around blending. I have a lot of tourism background, and I always give this example about the Kruger Park. The Kruger Park's mandate is not tourism. It's conservation of biodiversity. But they use tourism as a catalyst, and as a vehicle to generate revenue for biodiversity conservation. Why are we not then moving, quite strongly into identifying, like she's saying about mitigation? If that is bankable at the moment, why are we not then blending and finding adaptation elements and components within that? And use that, because if there's money around that, let's use it to de-risk, some of these investments. But I do think there's a lot of hope, and we need to keep on pushing. Maybe the last point I wanted to make, you can mention, who are the players in this space. So you mentioned NBI, SANBI, WRC. I think SEED is possibly a very small player in this space. We need scaling up of those in a big way. The need, specifically around adaptation, it's big. The margins are pretty small. Bankability of that is small, but the need is huge. You can talk about the floods that are happening. We just came from Limpopo now. Just this little rain that we had, Palabura, it's got lots of water all over. Places are flooding. It's a very dry area. And so people need to respond to that type of stuff. Who pays for that? Maybe there's no bankability around that, but there's a need.
Mm-hmm. Want to comment?
Yeah, I think that question about the just transition, it's an interesting question in the sense that who is the driver? There's no invisible driver. There's no national imperative that will make it happen automatically. I think it has to happen around very specific projects. So it has to be project-driven or program-driven. And driving it through a programmatic approach is difficult because those players are generally in the public sphere, not in the private sphere. So you have that issue around, the spaces in the middle there and the players on either side, and who's going to make it happen?
I think it's a really important conversation because I think it was 2 weeks ago the EU announced that they are funding the just transition, and the biggest chunk of the money is going to Germany and Poland, 2 OECD countries. Most of EU is anyway, but just to show that even Germany, who raised tariffs so that they could bring in renewable energy, and I know it's all on the mitigation side, not the, but they recognize that there's a transition element that even a country like Germany cannot handle. And I don't quite understand why there are delays in us trying to address that. And because of the negotiations, this has been on the table for decades, not so. This is half the reason why UNFCCC, I would argue, exists, that we know we need to do something, but how do we do it that is equitable, et cetera, et cetera. So it needs to be looked at more decisively, and more inputs need to be given. And I think to push the government to actually say, well, we will help miners adapt, we will and we'll move from coal to broader liquid fuels. The whole value chain of fossil fuels in general in the entire country needs to transition. How do we do it? And that's essentially a key element of that is adaptation, I would argue. I don't know if it's defined as that, would be defined. Is there a way of defining it where you are helping, setting up enterprise development to allow coal miners, say in Mpumalanga, to enter into other businesses or to be retrained to enter other businesses, or for agriculture to absorb certain, I don't know, but I think it's one of the things that would be very useful for someone like the NBI. I mean, all the collective brains in this room to address.
I think that is a great segue to end on, is that we need to have this conversation more. So obviously this is event 2 of a 4-event series that's specifically looking at this topic, but that broader context of the just transition is critical. And certainly the NBI is planning on engaging our member companies at CEO and practitioner level to say, what does this transition look like from a mitigation and an adaptation perspective? So just as a simple illustration, the work that our water team is doing, Joburg the supply and demand of water in Joburg will be out of balance from 2022. Right, so it's 2 years before we face Cape Town-esque type water management issues. The opportunity of that is we've got 2 years. Let's do something with that time. And so these conversations are very pertinent and very critical. And to end on an extremely optimistic note, we at the NBI have noticed so much more activity in the last year than we have in the last 10 years. There is a real zeitgeist and enthusiasm for dealing with these complex issues from businesses, from governments. I mean, I regularly speak to boards. I probably speak to 2 or 3 boards a month. We're speaking to government. The minister is really engaged on these issues. So now is the time. So I'm really optimistic about that. And key to this process is all of you going back, thinking about the kinds of projects that you're doing, the kinds of projects that you could do, how we will work with others, how we'll work for government, and we'll hit a bunch of development outcomes here, adaptation being one of them, which will then help us blend our finance in different ways. That's what we're aiming for here. So thank you very much for your attendance today. Thank you very much to Zaheer and the panel. We really appreciate your time. That was a really interesting conversation. It is the beginning of several other conversations. Because it's an NBI event, there is lunch outside. Part of what we do is building community, and so we'd like you to hang around and talk to each other and get to know each other. So please do have lunch, and if you have any other pressing questions for our excellent panelists, that would be the time. Thanks very much.